So we have kind of two major kind of items of business to deal with today. One is the Schiller text that we read, the Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man. And the other is just the topic of romanticism in general. We're going to try to establish some things that will help inform next week's reading, which is Hegel's introductory lectures on aesthetics. So while I'm on that topic, any volunteers for presenting next week? The Hegel? Okay, that's one. Is there another? Hegel can be a little bit daunting, but in fact, this is a relatively easy read. It's like the reading for this week, discursive. It's not going to be opaque like Kant, since it's lectures. Okay, great. You guys, great. All right. So let's get to the Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man. All right, so he starts with an epigraph. It's always important to pay attention to the epigraphs by Rousseau, by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was the great inspiration for Kant, and then we'll see that Schiller is trying to follow Kant. So what does Rousseau say? He says, if it is reason that makes man, then it is sentiment that guides him. So what does reason making man mean? It means that there's a self-production involved in our humanity, meaning we're not simply products of nature. We're products of reason. We make ourselves what we are through our reason, nonetheless guided by feeling. So that's to set the agenda for his letters, which is the aesthetic education of man, aesthetic education of humanity. So in what ways are self-production through our reason guided by our feelings and by our aesthetic faculties? So he writes, I have then your gracious permission to submit the results of my inquiry concerning art and beauty in the form of a series of letters. Sensible as I am to the gravity of such an undertaking, I am also alive to its attraction and its worth. I shall be treating of a subject that has a direct connection with all that is best in human happiness, and no very distant connection with what is noblest in our moral nature. Okay, so art and beauty, direct connection to what is best in human happiness, and not very distant connection to what is noblest in our moral nature. I shall be pleading the cause of beauty before a heart that is as fully sensible of her power as it is prompt to act upon it, a heart that, in an inquiry where one is bound to invoke feelings, no less often than principles, will relieve me of the heaviest part of my labors. What I would have asked of you as a favor, you in your largesse impose upon me as a duty, thus leaving me the appearance of merit, where I am in fact only yielding to inclination. The free mode of procedure you prescribe implies for me no constraint. On the contrary, it answers to a need of my own. Little practiced in the use of scholastic modes, I am scarcely in danger of offending against good taste by their abuse. My ideas derive from constant communing with myself. Constant communion with myself, rather than from any rich experience of the world, or from reading, will be unable to deny their origin. The last reproach they are likely to incur is that of sectarianism, and they are more liable to collapse out of inherent weakness than to maintain themselves with the support of authority and borrowed strength. So he's not entering into any philosophical debates where he's taking a side in them. Right, that's what sectarianism would mean. True, I shall not attempt to hide from you that it is for the most part Kantian principles on which the following theses will be based. But you must ascribe it to my ineptitude rather than to those principles, if in the course of this inquiry you should be reminded of any particular philosophical school. No, the freedom of your mind shall, I can promise you, remain inviolable. Your own feeling will provide me with the material on which to build. Your own free powers of thought dictate the laws according to which we are to proceed. Concerning those ideas that prevail in the practical part of the Kantian system, only the philosophers are at variance. The rest of mankind, I believe I can show, have always been agreed. Okay, so if we recall back to Kant, we've got theory, practice, and then aesthetics. So theoretical categories are derived from the practical categories, and of course the practical categories are derived from practice itself. And so what is he saying? He's saying everybody agrees with Kant concerning the practical philosophy. The only people who disagree are the philosophers. Once divested of their technical form, they stand revealed as the immemorial pronouncements of common reason. Remember that Kant thought that his own philosophy was just an explication of common sense. It was a technical analysis of what is otherwise common sense. And as data of that moral instinct that nature in her wisdom appointed man's guardian, until, through the enlightenment of his understanding, he should have arrived at years of discretion. So, meaning we have common sense, it might have taken us some time to theorize our common sense, but nonetheless, we had common sense long before we had an understanding of it. But it is precisely this technical form, whereby truth is made manifest to the intellect, which veils it again from our feeling. For alas, intellect must first destroy the object of inner sense if it would make it its own. Like the analytical chemist, the philosopher can only discover how things are combined by analyzing them, only lay bare the workings of spontaneous nature by subjecting them to the torment of his own techniques. In order to lay hold of the fleeting phenomenon, he must first bind it in the fetters of rule, tear its fair body to pieces by reducing it to concepts, and preserve its living spirit in a sorry skeleton of words. Is it any wonder that natural feeling cannot find itself again in such an image, or that in the account of the analytical thinker, truth should appear as paradox? Right, so the paradoxes only appear by virtue of the analysis, not in reality, not in practical, lived, felt reality. I too, therefore, would crave some measure of forbearance if the following investigations, in trying to bring the subject of inquiry closer to the understanding, were to transport it beyond reach of the senses. What was asserted above of moral experience must hold even more of the phenomenon we call beauty. So again, he's identifying moral experience with practical reason. For its whole magic, the phenomenon we call beauty, resides in its mystery and in dissolving the essential amalgam of its elements, we find we have dissolved its very being. So another kind of Kantian point for us to consider, how Kant considered the faculty of judgment to be a synthetic faculty. Right? So it combines things, and so of course it's destroyed when you analyze those things that it's combining and take them apart. But should it not be possible to make better use of the freedom you accord me than by keeping your attention fixed upon the domain of the fine arts? Is it not, to say the least, untimely to be casting around for a code of laws for the aesthetic world at a moment when the affairs of the moral offer interest of so much more urgent concern, and when the spirit of philosophical inquiry is being expressly challenged by present circumstances to concern itself with that most perfect of all the works to be achieved by the art of mankind, the construction of true political freedom. Okay, so why is he saying that? What's happening when he's writing these letters? What's going on in the world? So it's 1794. It's the French Revolution. It's the height of the French Revolution, or the depth of the crisis of the French Revolution. It's the Jacobin terror that's taking place in France. And the whole world is paying attention. Where's this revolution going? What the hell's happening? Got the Committee for Public Safety executing the revolutionaries in the name of protecting the revolution. All right, so what the hell is he talking about fine art when the entire world's attention is riveted by what's going on in France? Because it really was. I would not wish to live in a century other than my own, or to have worked for any other. We are citizens of our own age, no less than of our own state. And if it is deemed unseemly or even inadmissible to exempt ourselves from the morals and customs of the circle in which we live, why should it be less of a duty to allow the needs and taste of our own epoch some voice in our choice of activity? But the verdict of this epoch does not by any means seem to be going in favor of art. Not at least of the kind of art to which alone my inquiry will be directed. The course of events has given the spirit of the age a direction that threatens to remove it even further from the art of the ideal. This kind of art must abandon actuality and soar with becoming boldness above our wants and needs. For art is a daughter of freedom and takes her orders from the necessity inherent in minds, not from the exigencies of matter. But at the present time, material needs reign supreme and bend a degraded humanity beneath their tyrannical yoke. Utility is the great idol of our age, to which all powers are in thrall and to which all talent must pay homage. Weighed in this crude balance, the insubstantial merits of art scarce tip the scale, and bereft of all encouragement, she shuns the noisy marketplace of our century. The spirit of philosophical inquiry itself is wresting from the imagination one province after another, and the frontiers of art contract the more the boundaries of science expand. I'll just note here that this counterposition of art and science is going to come back when we read Nietzsche. And Nietzsche is going to have a contemptuous attitude about Schiller, but we'll see a lot of deep parallels between Schiller and Nietzsche, despite Nietzsche's disavowals. Expectantly, the gaze of philosopher and man of the world alike is fixed on the political scene, where now, so it is believed, the very fate of mankind is being debated. Does it not betray a culpable indifference to the common weal not to take part in this general debate? If this great action is, by reason of its cause and its consequences, of urgent concern to everyone who calls himself man, it must, by virtue of its method of procedure, be of quite special interest to everyone who has learned to think for himself. For a question that has hitherto always been decided by the blind right of might is now, so it seems, being brought before the tribunal of pure reason itself. And anyone who is at all capable of putting himself at the center of things and of raising himself from an individual into a representative of the species may consider himself at once a member of this tribunal, and at the same time, in his capacity of human being and citizen of the world, an interested party who finds himself more or less closely involved in the outcome of the case. It is therefore not merely his own cause that is being decided in this great action. Judgment is to be passed according to laws that he, as a reasonable being, is himself competent and entitled to dictate. Okay, so what's going on with the Jacobins? So they're trying to establish a civic religion of the cult of reason. trying to establish reason as the principle of the state. That's what the revolution represents. So the revolution represents replacing a state of tradition and custom with a state of reason, pure reason. They had, in the course of the revolution, restarted the calendar. They had changed the way days, weeks, months, years were characterized. Year one of the Republic. They restarted the calendar. Why? Because they didn't want the Christian calendar, because the Christian calendar represented the church, and they were overthrowing the church. As much as they were overthrowing the aristocracy, as much as they were overthrowing the king. So when he says human being and citizen, what does that recall? The Declaration of Rights of Human Being and Citizen in the French Revolution. That's the main sort of announcement of the principles of the revolution back in 1789. And yet, this rights of human being and citizen, a state based on reason, has come into crisis, into grief in 1794. It really looks like it's tottering, and it is about to. So the Jacobins are about to be brought down, and then in the course of events, we'll get Napoleon as a dictator and as emperor. So Beethoven, whose Ode to Joy we were just listening to, he was writing a symphony dedicated to Napoleon, and then he got pissed off when he heard that Napoleon was going to declare himself to be emperor. So it was fine when he was a general, it was fine when he was in the consulate, like one of the first consul, basically a dictator. But when he declared himself emperor, that was too much, and Beethoven scratched the dedication to Napoleon off the symphony. So that's a few years from when, it's 10 years from when, or about 10 years from when Schiller is writing, but nonetheless. Right? And notice, everyone should care as a member of the species. How tempting it would be for me to investigate such a subject in company with one who is as acute a thinker as he is a liberal citizen of the world, and to leave the decision to a heart that has dedicated itself with such noble enthusiasm to the weal of humanity. So weal means wealth. Commonweal, commonwealth. That's what that means. The kind of sustenance of humanity. What an agreeable surprise if, despite all differences in station, and the vast distance that the circumstances of the actual world make inevitable, I were, in the realm of ideas, to find my conclusions identical with those of a mind as unprejudiced as your own. That I resist the seductive temptation and put beauty before freedom can, I believe, not only be excused on the score of my personal inclination, but also justified on principle. I hope to convince you that the theme I have chosen is far less alien to the needs of our age than to its taste. More than this, if man is ever to solve the problem of politics in practice, he will have to approach it through the problem of the aesthetic, because it is only through beauty that man makes his way to freedom. But this cannot be demonstrated without my first reminding you of the principles by which reason is in any case guided in matters of political legislation. Okay, so that's a kind of a casually made, bold claim, right? So the problem of politics is going to be solved via the aesthetic. How and why could that possibly be true? All right, so let's remind ourselves of some things that Kant wrote in the Critique of Judgment, specifically about the sublime. So he used as examples of the sublime religion, so the conception of God in monotheism, the law, is an example of the sublime. Society itself, the state. Now, this is written a few years after what we read by Kant, the Critique of Judgment, but what did Kant say about the Jacobin Terror and about the revolution more generally? It was sublime. It was sublime. Meaning fearful, but not terrifying. Well, Jacobin terror, isn't that terrifying? Fearful, not terrifying. Meaning it brings us to the brink of being overwhelmed in our capacity to grasp it in our minds, but it doesn't completely overwhelm us. We can make sense of it. And the sublime is an aesthetic phenomenon. And when we judge something to be sublime, we're using our aesthetic faculties. So even though Schiller is using the term beauty, it's a kind of a catch-all term. It's not the exact category of beauty as distinct from the sublime in Kant's Critique of Judgment. So we can be kind of a little bit fearful in the face of what's going on, but ultimately we're able to take aesthetic pleasure, satisfaction out of the revolution. It makes sense to us. It doesn't overwhelm our faculties. We're able to make sense of it. We're able to hold it in our imagination and not be terrified or overwhelmed by it. You might think, easy for them to say, because they're in Germany, they're far away from the political action. Later, though, we'll be reading Hegel next week. Hegel, among others, welcomed Napoleon's invasion of Germany because it brought the revolution to Germany. So they're not simply distant spectators, passive observers. They are partisans, meaning they want the revolution to succeed not only in France, but in the world. In the world. Citizen of the world. Member of the species. He's not alone in this, by the way. So the rights of human being and citizen. Let me see, let me make sure that I have this here in our. I don't know if I do. Hold on. No, we do not. Oh. Hold on. Let me find something. Quickly. Just a quotation about this. Not that I had this on canvas, but I can. Okay, here we go. Oh, I meant to mute the projector. We'll bring it back. Okay, it's not letting me. Let me read it aloud. So this is from 1793, from the year before Schiller. And I'll let you guys guess who the author is. The tone of your letters had for some time given me pain on account of the extreme warmth with which they censured the proceedings of the Jacobins of France. I considered that sect as the same with the Republican patriots. Jump ahead here. It says, in the struggle which was necessary, many guilty persons fell without the forms of trial, and with them some innocence. These I deplore as much as anybody. And I shall deplore them, some of them, to the day of my death. But I deplore them as I should have done had they fallen in battle. It was necessary to use the arm of the people, a machine not quite so blind as balls and bombs, but blind to a certain degree. A few of their cordial friends met at their hands the fate of enemies. The time and truth will rescue and embalm their memories, while their posterity will be enjoying that very liberty for which they should never have hesitated to offer up their lives. The liberty of the whole earth was depending on the issue of the contest, and was ever such a prize won, with so little innocent blood. My own affections have been deeply wounded by some of the martyrs to this cause, but rather than it should have failed, I would have seen half the earth desolated. Were there but an Adam and an Eve left in every country and left free, it would be better than as it is now. Okay, so that is Thomas Jefferson, and he's one of the co-authors of the Declaration of the Rights of Human Being and Citizen. He was the ambassador to France at the time of the Revolution in 1789. He's one of the three authors of that document at the beginning of the French Revolution. And of course, he's the author of the Declaration of Independence that started the American Revolution. Okay. So again, that kind of sentiment, it's a little, it might seem like a kind of political fanaticism or something, and yet it has this kind of strange aesthetic passion to it. So let's turn to the notes that you guys posted. Let's see what that. Who were my presenters for today? You guys. Very good. Okay. All right. Okay. So, how would you guys like to proceed?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I just started by addressing his account of fragmentation and the loss of wholeness because you've been setting us up for that for the past several weeks, so I figured it would be important to discuss. Should I read?
Well, let's talk about that. So, again, via Rousseau, but also others at the time, like other people influenced by Rousseau, like Adam Smith, there is this acknowledgement that modern society is based on a division of labor, and that the division of labor means that everyone has a different experience of things and has a kind of specialized development and education of their faculties. So for instance, Adam Smith said that the division of labor, while responsible for increasing the standard of living in society, nonetheless made the human being as narrow and stunted as possible.
I had a paragraph about that I deleted because I felt like it was too long.
No, go ahead. What
no.
page? What page is it on?
Oh, I just meant I had written a little bit about
Oh,
it.
you read. Okay, so
Yeah.
So, please.
Okay. Well, yeah, I just acknowledged that there's that what Schiller, how he's posing this is very reminiscent of both Marx and Adam Smith talking about the division of labor and the classic example of the making of a pin. But that this sort of has a more like emotional tone in the way it's being expressed. At least
By Schiller, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so the fragmentation of the community, the fragmentation of the individual, right? So, especially the detailed division of labor, like the pin factory example that Adam Smith uses is the assembly line, basically. It's how you can produce more if each person isn't producing the whole thing, but just producing part of the thing. But then, right, you have basically a kind of breaking up of the action. You have a kind of disparate quality to the production process. So it's again, that would contribute to what is not desired, a kind of mechanization of the human being.
And Schiller is talking about it so much, at least the way he's talking about it, seems more about like pursuit of knowledge rather than just production assembly work, but it's more about even men of the sciences or branches of knowledge and innovation are only working within such a minute part of their own field that they're not really connected to like the broader project. And there's this sort of like shrinking spirit.
That's right. No, that's exactly right. So again, Adam Smith, when he said that the division of labor made the human being as narrow and as stunted as could be imagined, it wasn't just a kind of factory worker experience. It's any specialization. So that would be true of really anyone in this society. By comparison, and this is again a very Rousseauian idea, by comparison with smaller, simpler, less complex communities where everyone kind of does everything, right? So modern society seems to be based on the fact that not everyone does everything, and therefore we have this kind of particularized experience. So that's sort of the breaking up of the faculties, the innate human faculties. And he uses a language here that's a little strange to us, but nonetheless very common for the 18th century, for the Enlightenment, the noble savage versus the barbarian. The savage and the barbarian. Savage and the barbaric. So the savage is someone who is living closer to the state of nature and therefore not corrupted by civilization, whereas the barbarian, the barbaric, is the product of the decadent civilization, a kind of distortion of humanity by civilization. So their goal, this revolution of the 1700s, is to bring humanity back closer to a state of nature, without, however, giving up all the development of history that has taken place. Right, so that's the sort of trick. Is it possible for us to kind of correct for what civilization has done to us? And can that be done specifically through the political state? Mark, you have a question?
It's a small point. I was just going to say he kind of makes explicit that like generalization away from just the idea of like industrial labor. He actually, like, when he's talking about alienation, that way it says people reduced to their office.
Yep.
So it just seems like a very generalizable term.
To the particular role that they play. That's
Even
right.
going beyond like labor in a way.
That's right.
Like political, like a kind of like social office or like a place within hierarchy in general.
That's right. So I think that I pointed out to you guys the idea for universal history from a cosmopolitan point of view. I sent you guys a link to that. There's also Kant's essay on what is enlightenment, where he distinguishes between private and public reason, and I'll send you guys that as well. That's where Kant says that in our private reason, we're constrained to reason like a cog in a machine. Right, so we kind of have our narrow self-interest in society, and we have to fulfill that. He calls that the exercise of private reason. And freedom, on the other hand, so that's the realm of necessity. The realm of freedom is expressed in public reason, where everyone in society, despite their particular position in society and their particular conditions of self-interest and the various roles that they play in society, everyone can reason like a scholar. Everyone has the capacity to reason like a scholar, meaning in a kind of disinterested way, rather than in a kind of narrow, self-interested way. And because that is possible, even if most of the time we're only reasoning in our private capacity, if there's enough of a public sphere of like discourse and debate, then this will allow for everyone to reason like a scholar. And it's only through that he says the machinery can be changed. And the function of the cogs in the machine can be changed. us. Otherwise, we're kind of bound to only reproduce our function as cogs in the machine by struggling to preserve our self-interest in the machine.
Is he saying that one can only reason, or would only be able to reason like a scholar in a system that wasn't capitalist? Because he says, like, he talks about how the majority of men are like far too exhausted from just struggling for existence to think about, to think for themselves, and they're happy to resign to others the guardianship of their thoughts.
That's right.
So is he kind of anti-capitalist?
Sure.
Yeah.
Now it's a little early for capitalism.
Yeah.
A little early for capitalism. So the Industrial Revolution is underway, but not on the continent. And the impact of the Industrial Revolution in England, where it started out, is not clear to people yet. It will be soon enough, but it's not entirely clear to people. And so what we could say is that Adam Smith thought that society was developing in such a way as to decrease labor time and increase leisure time. But the Industrial Revolution has a perverse effect on that. So not capitalism yet, but nonetheless, right, people are bound to work, and therefore they don't necessarily have the capacity or the inclination. But the issue here, from a philosophical standpoint, is that pretty much everyone, 99.99% of the time, is reasoning in only their private capacity. They're only reasoning as cogs in a machine. So of course the question is, how is it possible that anyone is ever able to reason beyond being a cog in the machine? And of course Kant's answer to that is, very Rousseauian answer, the reason that we can reason as more than cogs in a machine is that we're capable of changing machinery. And the reason that we're capable of changing the machinery is that we're able to reason as more than a cog in the machine. So it's a dialectic of theory and practice. It's like kind of a tautology. Because we can change things, we must be able to reason in a way beyond what our self-interest is defined as right now. Because you can look at history and say people have changed things. And so the only way to account for that is to say that they can reason as more than just the particular role that they have in the social system.
So kind of on the question of like anti-capitalist sort of impulse here, like it's obviously a bit early, so we're looking at maybe like a proto-anti-capitalism insofar that he's obviously railing against like alienation.
Alienation, yeah. Utility also, utility.
Yeah. I guess my question, what I can't really suss out too much from the text, is like, so he obviously, as much as he has this proto sort of anti-cap thing going on, there's also definitely some like proto-reactionary tendencies. But I wonder, here's where my question is.
He's a romantic.
Well, it's a little hard for me to tell whether his sort of like reactionary sort of like debasing of the revolution, right, is a very like specific response to the form that the Jacobin affair has taken, or a reflection of a kind of more like classicist reactionary impulse that might just be a little more general for Schiller. It's very hard for me to see what the case may be. I wonder if you have an opinion about that.
All right, so the issue is, and this is going to lead us into Hegel in some ways, although Hegel's just going to deal with this in a very cursory way in the lectures that we'll read next week. So he deals with it in more detail in the Phenomenology of Spirit, which is that the Jacobins made the mistake of allowing, from Schiller's standpoint, reason and sensibility to depart. Right? In other words, they tried to establish a kind of rigid, kind of abstract notion of reason that violated common sense. Right? And yet, so they couldn't sort of explain to themselves how they were going wrong, and so it just seemed to follow a kind of a logic. And you'll see that Schiller is already, in the parts that I read, said that part of this had to do with the desperate struggle to survive, utilitarian needs of the people. And so the Jacobin terror was conditioned by material conditions of deprivation in France at the time. And so it literally is poor people demanding that corrupt people at the top be punished. Right, so it's to root out corruption. That's what the Committee for Public Safety is doing. It's going after the revolutionaries who seem to be betraying the revolution through personal corruption. And yet, once you get that process going, then it turns out like anyone who's not like a starving poor person is got to be corrupt in some way or another. Right, so the revolution kind of consumed itself according to this kind of abstract criterion of like how we understand human interest according to reason. That's part of what Schiller's trying to address here. So we'll see. I wouldn't just, I wouldn't say, look, he's a liberal, he's on the side of the revolution, he's not on the side of the counter-revolution, he's not on the side of the monarchy coming back, the restoration, he's not. No, not at all. But he does think that you can't change things more than common sense will allow. Meaning, ultimately, things will be decided based on the sensibilities of the people. And so, if you try to pursue a kind of abstract program, even with the best of intentions, it won't work. Right? So the political system has to be bounded by not just reason, but judgment. And that's an old idea. Like, that's not like a brand new idea, that's a kind of an old idea. Meaning that you put it in the hands of a jury to decide, right? That it's not just a mechanical application of the law to a case, but people have to judge whether the law actually applies in each particular case. And the jury can decide, no, it doesn't apply, and the jury can make mistakes. Right? The exercise of judgment allows for mistakes in a way that the mechanical application of abstract principles would seem to rule out mistakes and yet would be responsible for making more mistakes than allowing people to exercise their judgment. Right? It's a very kind of complicated, from our standpoint, idea, and yet it shouldn't be all that complicated. Meaning, who do you trust? Do you trust the prosecutor who's operating as a cog in a machine of a justice system that it needs to get results? It needs to find people guilty because otherwise they're not doing their job well? Or do you also have just regular people brought in to exercise their common sense judgment as a check on the prosecutor who's just a sort of mechanized instrument of the state applying the law, just trying to get a result? Right, so that's why that exists. That's why trial by jury exists rather than trial by legal experts. Right, because legal experts are going to be very narrow in their understanding of things. And they're going to be interested in keeping their job and in furthering their career. Whereas people off the street serving the jury can reason like scholars and judge the case without any personal stakes as to what the verdict is. It's not like, I'm going to be voted out as state's attorney if I fail to convict in this high-profile case. Right? Because that would be the exercise of private, self-interested reason as a cog in the machine. So the Jacobins, the Committee for Public Safety, they tried to create a group of people, the Committee for Public Safety, who were the most impeccable, virtuous people. And as it turned out, that didn't work.
Back to the sort of idea of his anti-capitalism or proto-anti-capitalism. There was something interesting about when he lays out his sort of strategy of like affecting political change through the aesthetic, and his sort of like value he gives to the aesthetic. It lets you step outside of itself and have things that are not directly connected to like survival. And then he talks about how that lets people understand each other in this way that they couldn't otherwise. And I thought it was interesting in the way that commodity fetishism, especially once you get into like full capitalism, and then like especially like characters like 1950s, 60s with like mass like consumer culture, how that seems to kind of fulfill what he wanted, in that it has these things that don't exist for like a practical purpose, but in of themselves as like a mode of expression. But then it seems to have had the opposite effect that he's expecting it to have.
Okay, we have to be very careful about all those things. Namely, it's not commodity fetishism yet. Commodity fetishism is not consumerism. So there are a few sort of little wrinkles to what you just laid out there. So, and also commodity fetishism and capitalism are not based on symbolic. No, they're based on actual material things, in terms of practical things. So we stick with Schiller on this. The question is, how do we measure utility, right? So it's, he is kind of alert to the fact the French Revolution, unlike the American Revolution, and they're connected. Like I mentioned Thomas Jefferson, they're connected events. The American Revolution is based on just straight up freedom, political discontent, whatnot. Right? No taxation without representation, whatever. France, on the other hand, they did experience a kind of economic crisis of poverty. They did. And so it was like a kind of a bread riot that really kicks off the French Revolution and keeps it in that kind of mode. And so it seems to be a much more straightforward example of the tension between material need and freedom. So it's not, again, it's not at all the Marxist idea that like consumerism gives symbolic satisfaction to compensate for lack of material. No, yeah, this is not. Okay, so it's much more of an ideology problem. So the real issue is this. What is motivating people politically? And he does set up this distinction where he's saying if people are motivated purely out of material need, then they're not able to reason as to the true nature of politics and the need for politics, which has to be driven by freedom and not merely material need. Like that's the juxtaposition he's setting up here, right? So he's setting up if politics is driven by material necessity, then it will necessarily violate the higher necessity of freedom. Necessity and freedom. We were talking about that with Kant. And so he's acknowledging that. Right? And so, but then he's really turning his attention to, well, in what way would people act according to the needs of freedom? They would act more according to aesthetic principles of judgment. They wouldn't act purely at the level of practical reason. In other words, insofar as people are only acting according to practical necessity, then their pursuit of freedom is constrained and limited. Right, so he's, making what would appear to be a counterintuitive case, which is that, again, politics should be guided by sensibility and not by practical necessity. Now we're, of course, way down the capitalist highway. It's 2025, meaning, is there any political anything that is not adjudicated according to utilitarian principles of practical necessity? At the end of the day, isn't that like the trump card? Isn't that what people wheel out? They wheel out some utilitarian measure of practical efficacy. Right? They don't, they might use the language of like freedom and sensibility and judgment, but they're not ultimately it will come down to some statistical study of something or other, right?
But that is itself like a small screen, because behind that there's just like decisions of power, right? Like,
Sure.
it's not like neoliberal statisticians are like actually taken seriously within the high halls of power, right? Like that's like a presentation for us, not for them.
Yeah, that's a complicated judgment you're making. The question would be, that might be true, but the question is, why do the politicians even bother to make a statistical argument before the public, even if it's a spurious one? Even if they're not really making decisions based on those statistical facts, they still feel the need to provide evidence to say this is why this policy is reasonable, because look at these stats. So again, the public, in other words, whether the politicians are acting according to their motives, still the public is misled or led to believe that the reason is in fact rational, reasonable, but in this limited way that Schiller's talking about. Right? So can the public allow itself, can it feel that it can afford to make more aesthetically based judgments guided by the principle of freedom? Does anyone talk about freedom anymore? Is that like other than like as an empty phrase? Like in other words, I think freedom now just means freedom to use statistics freely. Or something, like freedom from misinformation. It's like freedom means that we let the scientists provide the numbers. That's all that freedom means. As long as the scientists can provide the numbers, that's all the freedom we need. Schiller is saying that's not freedom. It's not freedom. Right, so this is not the realm that we're usually accustomed to thinking about politics at all. So, again, he does see the Jacobins as guided by reason, but misguided by reason into a kind of blind alley, which is unfortunate, in that the conditions for that were the material desperation of the masses, in which the whole question of common sensibility was left out of account. I guess I'll just say one thing about like romanticism and like the reactionaries or whatever. So reaction, by the way, just means wanting to restore the status quo ante. So does it mean reactive? Is one of my pet peeves in life. I hate the way people misuse the term reactionary. Reactionary doesn't mean reactive. Reactionary means trying to turn the historical clock back to what used to be the case. So it means like conservative, reactionary in the sense of not just maintaining things the way they are, but trying to restore something that is in the past. So he's not a reactionary like that. He's not a capital R reaction. That's what it's called. It's called the reaction. So the reaction were the people who wanted to bring the absolute monarchy back and turn the clock back on the revolution. So Edmund Burke, who's an important British, actually Rousseauian, and also liberal, he had a critique of the French Revolution where he said, basically the result of the French Revolution is going to just put you in a society ruled by lawyers who are going to use sophistry to pursue material interests. And that all the common sensibilities and cultural norms of the people are going to be violated in the name of reason, but in this very narrow and distorted notion of reason. Right? So he objected to the execution, especially of Marie Antoinette, because she was this beautiful woman, and she was the queen. She had this kind of status, and what would it mean to execute her? It would be to reduce her to an animal, and in doing so, you reduce all people to animals, and then the state would just be free to execute people willy-nilly according to specious legal proceedings. Which seemed to turn out to be the case with the Jacobin terror. Right? They did put people on trial, they did have legal proceedings, but they still killed a lot of innocent people. So now, even Burke is not like a reactionary, like total arch reactionary, no. And also his kind of more romantic conservatism led him to do things like critique British imperialism in India. So I mean, Burke is one of the most prominent critics of British imperialism in India, saying the British are destroying the culture. Through commercial interest and greed, right? So, again, what we think of as like reactionary nowadays is it's not a simple matter in the late 1700s in the face of what's going on. In the world.
I was using the term in more contemporary sense of just someone who's, so you can stop it,
Yeah, so Schiller would be more like an Edmund Burke. He would. However, he would differ from Burke in the sense that he would be more on the side of the revolution, whereas Burke is like that, and it's just it's just sort of impeached itself. It's sort of invalidated itself. Whereas his attitude, like Hegel's, is going to be, they're making serious mistakes, but nonetheless, this is the right direction.
Okay, so if capitalism, going a little back, is like reduces everything to utility, and that definitely seems to be true on like a political sense, but I guess there's an element in which personally you would expect, like on the personal or like market level, for things to be sold to you based on utility, but that seems to be increasingly
Use value.
not the case, where it's instead, like advertisements don't tell you what the product does, they try to give it this aesthetic.
Even back
word that
then,
seems to be-
products were dumped on the public simply because people needed to make money off them. Like even back then that happened, right? That there were rich, powerful interests who had commodities that they needed to be sold in order to return on their investment, and basically foisted these things onto the public, and the public didn't have much of a choice.
But I guess the primary mode of because nowadays it's like even if you buy like a car, the way you
Uh-huh.
advertise your car is the thing that does have this utilitarian need, but
Mhm.
it's even that's not sold to you on utilitarian means, like it has this and this and this features. It's like through this aesthetic, this will make you like a real American by like buying a Ford F-150 or something.
Sure, there's psychological manipulation.
But I
Absolutely.
guess it feels interesting that
Very few people
that
buy
mode
cars
seems to be-
based on that, though.
Well,
Most
I mean,
people do research and,
I think I agree with what you're driving at. Like we're increasingly finding like a kind of like empty sort of like hollow point where we expect to find like value, right? There's Mohan wrote a collection of really interesting essays that I can share with you if you want, where he's kind of talking it in terms of like climate crisis and like in the absence of any sort of like reference of value, like capitalism not turning to like nature as this like meta value to somehow ground itself. And it won't complex argument, but yeah, I think like the turn to like online rentierism, right? Like just subscriptions for nothing or subscriptions for things you already had, like it's kind of this like emptiness of value, increasing emptiness of value. That's like doesn't even have, it's not even pegged to like use anymore. Like use value evaporating into pure exchange value.
So let me just say, okay, so we should be careful. So let's try to stick to the text because it's the common reading that everybody has, and we can't assume that everyone has the ability to talk about things at this level, and also it's just not actually established, so we're not going to be able to deal with utilitarianism in a precise way. We have to deal with it in a broader sense, and so all we're dealing with here is that coming out of the Enlightenment, there is a general sense that society should be based on reason rather than arbitrary power. Right? So he already said, might doesn't make right. Like in the first few paragraphs, it's like, we're living in a world that's rebelling against might making right. Okay, so that's the principle. The principle might does not make right. Right, so him and his readers and we would also say there's something wrong with the idea that might makes right. What's a new idea? It's a new idea. And so like power, like Foucault, like will. Hit this button. it's not like everything is power. We don't like that. We don't accept that. Our common sense rejects that. If you say everything is power, you're rejecting the common sense of humanity. Now, by comparison, in the past, might made right. Everybody accepted that might made right. Why did they accept that? You know why? Because they thought it was God's will. It was God's will that some people are stronger than others. And so might made right because it was an expression of God's will, because God's will was expressed in everything that happened. Okay, so that is not what we believe anymore. We don't believe that people in power are there because God put them there. Okay. We do not believe that might makes right. We do not believe that power should be an end in itself and should rule over humanity. What do we believe? Nonetheless, we do believe reason should come to bear in the political sphere. Right, so that's the starting point. And then he's saying, yes, we all seem to agree on this idea, and yet there's something wanting in that. There's something missing from that. Depends on what we mean by reason. Right, so that's how we still proceed. And so that's where, again, the problem of capitalism it's not operative. It's not operative. So do you guys know who Michael Moore is, the filmmaker Michael Moore, documentarian, right? So he made a film in the financial crisis era called Capitalism: A Love Story. And the conceit of the film was that he and his wife were married by the Protestant and married by a Protestant minister. And he was like, I wonder what my Protestant minister thinks about capitalism, because after all, capitalism is based on the Protestant work ethic. And so if any religion is like pro-capitalism, it would be Protestantism. So I would talk to the minister who married me and my wife and say, what do you think about capitalism? So what did the minister say? It's evil. And then he was like, I wonder about this. So he went and talked to a Buddhist monk and a Muslim imam and a Catholic priest and a Jewish rabbi, and he asked them all the same question. What do you think about capitalism? And they all said, it's evil. So then why do we have it? Right? So that's a deep question. Right? And pretty much all traditional and even modern, up-to-date versions of traditional moral values condemns capitalism as evil. Why do we have it? It seems to work practically in some way, but we kind of accept as somehow necessary and unavoidable. And so we kind of accept it as a kind of a necessary evil. But then we have this idea that it's a necessary evil, so we should accept it, but keep it within constraints. Right? Not let it run rampant. And yet that doesn't seem to work either. Right? So it's still left with the question of how do we exercise political judgment. Right? So rationality, reason seems to dictate politics, and that seems to not be enough. It seems to fail. And fail in a way that everyone knows it fails. Common sense, everyone knows it fails. Everyone knows it fails. And yet, we still do it. Right? It seems reasonable. It violates our common sense. That's where Schiller is with this. So it has to do with what we mean by reason. That's really the issue. What do we even mean by reason? And without going into psychology, without having to go into psychology, without having to go into some Freudian or Lacanian whatever, no, that's not necessary. that doesn't exist for them. Not necessary to address this. Okay. So then, right, and he acknowledges this is a difficult thing that he's trying to put his finger on. It's a difficult object to bring into focus. Right? And yet, he thinks the readers will know what he's talking about. Right, so let's try to see what we think. Kind of following Schiller, like, is it plausible what he's saying? Right? Because we can't really get ahead of ourselves. Meaning, we don't want Schiller to be Marx. That's just not going to happen. And even Marx is contentious. I told you that there are two figures who are going to be important in this course. More the case later in the course than now, but because we're heading in a certain direction, the readings, Marx is one and Baudelaire is the other. Right? So Marx and Baudelaire are the sort of missing presences in our syllabus because they are the sort of modernist moment. There's going to be this kind of mid-1800s moment missing. We're going to jump from Hegel to Nietzsche. So we're going to jump clear over the middle of the 19th century and pick up in the modernist capitalist era with Nietzsche. And we'll deal with that when we get there. Right? Because, like I said, there are some parallels here with Schiller and Nietzsche, meaning, to our mind, with Nietzsche it definitely is that. With Schiller it just suggests that, okay, what he's talking about is capitalism. But it's going to be more explicit with Nietzsche, even though it's not as explicit as with Marx. So we'll get there. We will get there. I promise we will get there. But we're not there yet. Right, but we're in we're in the bourgeois revolution. That's where we are. We're in the American and French Revolution. We're in this kind of, Enlightenment political culmination of the 18th century, of the 1700s. That's kind of where we are with Schiller. Mm-hmm.
So without going into a direction of psychologizing or psychoanalyzing, should we actually just maybe touch a little bit on his treatment of the subject? Because he sort of takes a little sideswipe at Descartes, but then also kind of stays true to dualism.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, that I find it kind of interesting that he doesn't really spend a lot of time demonstrating that position or going back to it. He just kind of lays it out very quickly. But I find it very interesting, both that he refutes Descartes and that he's sort of just a strict dualist in a sense.
It's Kant. It is Kant. So Schiller really is following Kant, very closely. And not just Kant's Critique of Judgment that we read, but the entire Kantian system. So Critique of Pure Reason, Critique of Practical Reason, Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, the essays I mentioned. I'll send the other one, the What is Enlightenment essay, to you guys via an announcement on Canvas. And also political writings by Kant, namely on the maxim that works in theory but not in practice, which is Kant's essay on the Revolution. Kant's essay on the Revolution, not on the French Revolution, on the American Revolution, and before that, the English Revolution.
So when he just kind of lays out, I think that what he actually says is things are because they are, or something like that, separated from thinking, the cogito or whatever. So I mean, is that an argument that Kant has developed that he's expecting we're familiar with, or how it's a bold claim, right? It's a big gigantic claim, and he just doesn't really address it.
Well, explicate what you think the claim is.
The claim that you can claim that things just are as they are, or I forget exactly how it would probably be important to look at his exact phrasing, but I think what he's specifically doing in the way that he phrases it is he's again kind of distancing himself from the Cartesian formulation. I think therefore I am. He's saying, in fact, I think he says things are not what they are because of thinking or feeling or something. He says they are because they are.
Well, that's that's his right. So he's not a rationalist, right? So Cartesian rationalism, he's not following that. he's following Kant. And Kant, supposedly, I think Kant talked about this early in our reading from Critiques Judgment, but Kant thought that he had overcome this antinomy of empiricism and rationalism.
Right, so for Kant, wouldn't the statement be things are as they appear? He's saying they are as they are, as if we're seeing things in themselves.
Page 116, is that what we're talking about?
I don't know.
I think it is.
Go ahead.
Not because we think will or feel do we exist, but not because we exist do we think will or feel.
Yeah.
Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, and then I think in the next sentence or so, or somewhere around there, he says,
We are because we are,
We are because
feel,
we are,
think,
right
and
there.
will because outside ourselves something other than ourselves exists too.
yeah, so like if we were really following Kant, I would expect him to say we are because we appear, not we are because we are. That's like a much harder ontological sort of plane.
It might appear to be so, but we have to be careful. Okay, so, I try to tread lightly on we're reading philosophy, but I still try to tread lightly philosophically. And one of the ways that I try to tread lightly philosophically is idealism materialism. And the reason for that is that a lot of bullshit has sailed under that flag of materialism versus idealism. And also because bad Marxism calls itself materialist, and postmodernism also thinks of itself as anti-idealist, as a materialist. And I think it's been a mess. In other words, it's my considered judgment as an intellectual and as an experienced teacher. This is not a fruitful line of inquiry. It's not a good starting point. Materialism, not a good starting point. Because what's meant by materialism becomes the bottom of this thing. Now, anti-idealism, let's talk about that. It shouldn't be solipsism. It's not a question of, are there things other than me? It's not that. It's not. That's just not the level at which Descartes was operating. It's not. So cogito ergo sum doesn't deny the existence of things outside himself. It just says the only thing that you can be certain about, it's a certainty principle. The only thing you can be certain about, you can't be certain about those things that exist independently of us. The only thing you can be certain of is that you're asking the question of what you can be certain of. It's the only thing you can be certain of. So it's not about thinking things into existence. That's not nobody ever thought that. This is like a kind of materialist anti-idealism that the postmodernists have, that idealism thinks that we think the world. No, nobody ever thought that. Plato didn't think that. Nobody ever thought that. That's just not, because no philosophy violates common sense. No philosophy violates common sense. No. Right? So things exist outside of us. Of course they do. Now, the thing is, they exist outside of us. How do we experience them? That's the Kantian thing. So when Kant is dealing in appearances, he's not saying we're not dealing with things outside of us, we're only dealing with the appearances to us. He's saying we can't do without the appearances of things. In other words, the appearances are an inevitable aspect of things. So that's why it's not like, I don't know, what's the paradox? If a tree falls in the woods and no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? Depends on what you mean by sound. If you mean vibrating air, then it made a sound. If you mean the excitation of the oral nerve, then it didn't make a sound. Right? Because vibrating air is not a sound unless it's perceived as a sound. Right? So it's just not, it's not like does anything exist outside of us. It's not, this is 2025 barbarism. No. It's not 1794. Enlightenment, reasonableness, common sense, subjectivity.
No, I get that, but there's still a difference between claiming that you only see an appearance and claiming that you see a thing as is, right? So I don't think either one is suggesting that it might not be there, for example.
It's empirical knowledge, right? So, have we been directed?
Oh, I said 116.
16, not
Yeah.
60. Okay.
Yeah, I'm nasally, sorry.
And 160, well, at least we have empirical knowledge there. So Schiller didn't fail me anyway. Every page of Schiller is going to reinforce my point, for sure.
Yeah,
Okay, here we go.
Yeah.
Freedom. Okay, freedom, remember that. Anything italicized is important. It's not just rhetorical flourish. Okay, we exist. Not because we think, will, or feel do we exist. And not because we exist do we think, will, or feel. We are because we are, we think, feel, and will, because outside of ourselves, something other than ourselves exists too. Huh. Now that's a complicated one. So this is, Mark, what you're kind of focused on. Because, notice, it's the relation thing, right? So he's saying it's not just our subjectivity, but it's the objectivity, and it's the relation between subject and object. Meaning, our cognitive faculties, our subjectivity, is in relation to something. Right? It's not like just self-contained. It's in relation to something. So it's only in relation to things that we think, feel, and will. Okay. Right? So that's the issue. In other words, there's no I without the world. There's no I without the world. It's the subject-object dialectic. And Kant's dealt with that. I mean, Descartes has his own way of dealing with that, which is the two-substance issue. Right? So it's like a different kind of issue. But subject-object, right? So let's see what he says here. Actually, it's important because I think it's in the larger person and condition. Okay. All right. When abstraction rises to the highest level it can possibly attain, it arrives at two ultimate concepts, before which it must halt and recognize that here it has reached its limits. It distinguishes in man something that endures and something that constantly changes. That which endures it calls his person, and that which changes his condition. Person and condition, the self and its determining attributes, which in the absolute being we think of as one and the same, are in the finite being eternally too. Amid all persistence of the person, the condition changes. Amid all the changes of condition, the person persists. We pass from rest to activity, from passion to indifference, from agreement to contradiction, but we remain, and what proceeds directly from us remains too. In the absolute subject alone do all its determining attributes persist with the personality, since all of them proceed from the personality. What the Godhead is, and all that it is just because it is. It is consequently everything for all eternity because it is eternal. Since in man, as finite being, person and condition are distinct, the condition can neither be grounded upon the person nor the person upon the condition. Meaning that would be God, right? And we're not God. Were the latter the case, the person would have to change. Were the former the case, the condition would have to persist. Hence, in each case, either the personality or the finiteness cease to be. Not because we think, will, or feel do we exist, and not because we exist do we think, will, or feel. We are because we are. We think, feel, think, and will because outside of ourselves something other than ourselves exists too. The person, therefore, must be its own ground. For what persists cannot proceed from what changes. And so we would, in the first place, have the idea of absolute being grounded upon itself, that is to say, freedom. Like the ultimate being is freedom. The condition, on the other hand, must have a ground other than itself. It must, since it does not owe its existence to the person, i.e. is not absolute, proceed from something. So this is what we were talking about. Actually, I realized last week we got a little bit sidetracked, and so we need to repair some of that. Teleology, autonomy, self-rule, as opposed to heteronomy, other rule. So the reality of the subject means that the subject is its own cause. It's not determined by external causes. It's self-determined, it's autonomous. The reality of the subject, right? Remember I said, with Kant, we're dealing with is establishing the irrefutable reality of the subject. Irrefutable, meaning we're not just a bundle of effects of other things.
I'm a little confused with that. So is like in terms of the sort of like formal, eternal I, is it, I mean, is this like a theological claim? Or like what exactly is the nature of this subject? That like this seems to persist before and after death, I guess?
Well, rationalism was based on theology in the sense of what persisted was the divine spark or the soul.
Okay, that's right.
Okay, so he doesn't want to leave it at that though. In other words, what he wants to do instead, notice he doesn't say soul or divine spark, he says the person.
Mhm.
The person is what persists in the change. He's not saying that people don't change, he's not. But he's saying something changes. Remember the dialectic of being and becoming that we talked about earlier in the course? Maybe we need to come back to that now. Meaning transformation, right? I kind of warned you guys, it's very difficult to think transformation because you have to think two contradictory things at the same time. You have to think continuity and change.
Right, but I'm wondering how this extends before birth and after death. Like, is this like, are we talking about a soul that's unchanging, or is this something that only exists during the course of a lifespan?
Is he talking about that?
Well, I'm saying the thing that doesn't change, the I, right, the person. Like, what I'm saying is
We
that-
can't step outside of ourselves. It's as simple as that.
Right, but like, does it come into being along with our body, or are we talking about a soul? The person. It's just not clear from the text. It could go
It's
either.
not, right, because it's not what he's addressing. He's addressing person and condition. He's not talking about person and soul. Right?
Yeah, but the eternal and like unchanging nature of this person is pretty key to the argument, so we should.
Well, eternal meaning persists through time. Okay, so remember what Kant was doing. Right, empiricism, sense data perception. So with sense data perception, so empiricism. We have sense data perception. The problem is sense data perception takes place at particular moments of space and time. Then the question is, what unites those things? Right, and that's why it's the transcendental subject, which again, we want to demystify these terms. Like, in other words, we shouldn't like run for cover or dive under a bush when we hear words like transcendental. No, it means something very specific, meaning there is a subject that transcends any point in space and time of empirical sense data perception. It persists.
Persist would have been, but like persistence would have been a word that wouldn't have troubled me, but the word eternal takes me into a theological sort of.
It could also mean atemporal. Atemporal. Right, in other words, there has to be something that is experiencing time and space. That is reducible to time and space. Because it's a priori, right? Remember, it's a priori?
Yeah, I'm sorry everyone to get hung up on this, I know I'm dragging this on, but the part, like, at the end of your chart, you have an arrow, just kind of going forever, but the problem is we don't live forever, and that's the part I'm asking about. Specifically, I get everything else about the sequence.
Yeah, we're finite. He said finite.
Okay, so the I dies.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's what I
No,
was
it's
trying
fine. He said it's finite. In other words, I was kind of like, well, wait, like, do we know whether we were reincarnated or there's heaven or hell or any kind of immortality? We don't know. Do we know? Is there any evidence? Like, can we? Is that something that a philosopher can answer? Not really. Right? That would be according to faith alone. A matter of faith alone. Maybe there is a fifth dimension or something when we go to after death. But no, right? So the question is this. The reality of the a priori, the transcendental subject, that is characterized by, not by sense data perception, but by the unity of apperception. Right? That's the person. That's the self. That's the subject. And so when we refer to the self, the subject, the person, in the way that he's using the term person, because you can use these terms in a variety of ways. It seems like he's using the term person to refer to the self and the subject. Are we referring to anything or not? Right? And look, we're not naive, it's 2025, postmodernism happened. The subject has been denied. The reality of the subject has been denied. That has been the point of postmodernism, to deny the reality of the subject. They weren't the first to come up with this. They were not. There were ancient philosophers in various cultures. There were debates within Christian theology about the self, the personhood, the soul. It's why medieval Christians thought you could lose your soul without knowing it. In other words, the soul was independent of subjective experience. You could sell your soul to the devil without even realizing that you had done so, and you had lost your soul. So it was not a category of subjective experience. That's what these guys are talking about. They're talking about subjective experience. They're not talking about, is there a soul independent of anything that happens and any experience that we have of what happens. Okay. So in that respect, of course, there were philosophers who said our experience is just a veil of deception. It's this, the self is an illusion, right? There are ancient philosophers, thinkers, mystics, theologians who are like, this world is a world of illusion. And the one key illusion is that we believe that we ourselves exist. That's vanity. It's vanity. That we think that we exist. That's vanity. And if you give into that, you succumb to the deceptive appearances of the illusion of the world. Schopenhauer, we'll deal with Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer's response to Hegel and Kant was no. And Nietzsche is going to try to go there. And he's going to be like, you know what? No, I can't. I tried to be a Schopenhauerian, but right? So, again, there is, like, if you will, a ongoing debate, we could say, about the reality of the subject. But the thinkers we're going to be dealing with in this course all take the reality of the subject as the starting point. And then try to show that. So, now, what is this unity of the subject grounded in? What's the ultimate reality of this, according to Kant and Schiller? So we're 4 weeks into our primary readings, 5 weeks into the course. What is the basis of the reality of this subject that has a unity that transcends space and time in terms of empirical experience? Freedom. So this is very peculiar to say the reality of the subject has its basis in freedom. And freedom is defined as change. But this is completely the opposite of ancient philosophy, where the only thing that's real is that which is not changeable. Right, so he's not saying that. He's not saying, oh, the person is eternal the way Plato thought of forms as eternal. No, of course not. The person is obviously not eternal in that sense. Of course not. It's finite. And yet has a reality that transcends empirical experience of space and time. Right? It's not peggable to the temporal spatial moment. Right, so it's a very peculiar argument, but we're establishing it, and we're using Schiller now to kind of review our Kant in case we didn't have it, well established yet. The ultimate reality is freedom. That's the ultimate reality. Again, it's Rousseau. I came across a quotation by Jose Ortega y Gasset. He said, what physical nature is to animals, history is to mankind. So animals are based on physical nature. Humanity is based on history. And what characterizes history? Change. So our basis is the changeability of our freedom. So the aesthetic education of man, education, meaning we don't have a fixed aesthetic sensibility. We don't. That's the point. That's why there would be a relationship between politics and the aesthetic, because politics is also the realm of change, at least in their view. Right? Ancient people didn't think of politics as the realm of change the way he does, because ancient people weren't doing revolution. He's living in a time of revolution. Remember Robert Pittman from the first week of class. Why is change the big question in philosophy at this time? Because modernity is all about change. All right, so our basis, our ultimate reality as a species is freedom. It's change. But how do we navigate that? How do we understand that? How do we experience it? How do we grasp it? How do we guide it? So that's where, if we have a narrow definition of reason, we're going to not be able to inhabit that condition properly in this world. That's really his point. But when we are guided by sentiment, when we're guided by sensibility, by our aesthetic faculties, that we're guided by our freedom in a way that our pure reason or our practical reason will mislead us. And then the question is, how and why is that the case? So, now the beginning in time, this business, I just want to talk about this, which is to say that we can't experience our own beginning or our own end. I mean, he actually does get into the question of the finitude of the subject, meaning that experience happens between beginning and end, but beginning and end themselves are not experienceable. Meaning, we come into being in the process of becoming. It's not like, now I exist. No. We have a grasp of our existence, of our being, only as a function of a process of becoming. In other words, we're educated into existence. We don't just exist. Like, that's why we can't peg it to a moment in time. This is, this is when I came into existence. It's like my awareness, just boom. No. Not as an individual person, but also not as a species. Not as a species. Is there like a definite beginning point? I think that Noam Chomsky has this idea. Do you guys know who Noam Chomsky is? So he's a linguist. So he has this idea that at a certain point in natural evolution, like cosmic rays hit the earth and caused a genetic mutation in humans. And that's why we have language and the animals don't have language, because we were just hit by this genetic mutation at a certain point in time, and there it is. It's total act of God.
Everybody's gonna leave it as.
Huh? Yeah. Whereas actually, the Enlightenment, the 1700s, they already had this idea that there is no like exact beginning point. That humans evolved historically over a long period of time to acquire and develop the faculties that they have. In other words, there's a historical origin. It's in the process of becoming that we became what we are. Right? That was already clear to people in the 1700s. Right? Even though today we have a hard time with that. Right? We want like scientific data to prove the exact point at which human consciousness existed. We're never going to find that. Okay, so let's take a short break and then we'll come back and get into the main categories of the text. The notes that you guys have. Yeah, that's a slightly different framing. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Let's try to resume, even though we're waiting for some people to return. So I'll send you guys the link to the What is Enlightenment piece by Kant, since I referenced it. All right, so there is a chart of terms that I did come up with for today that I'd like us to refer to now to help us with Schiller. And you'll see that attached to it on the side is Nietzsche, but we're not at Nietzsche yet, so we'll stick with Schiller. So how Schiller is translating Kant. So if we have the Kantian themes, the faculties of understanding, reason, and judgment, first, second, and third critique. The understanding has to do with theory and concepts. Reason has to do with practice, desire, morality. And judgment is dialectical and mediates theory and practice by way of feelings and aesthetic imagination. The way that Schiller translates this into his terminology is form drive and sense drive, the dialectic of form drive and sense drive, that is mediated by or synthesized in the play drive. And that these correspond to the phenomena of Kant's critique of judgment. If you remember, the beautiful corresponds most to the understanding, the sublime corresponded most to practical reason, and the three phenomena, the way he structured the argument in the critique of judgment, first determination of the faculty of aesthetic judgment was by way of the example of the experience of the beautiful, then the experience of the sublime, and finally the experience of beings as teleological, or living form. Living form. Teleological beings have living form. Beautiful objects have form. Sublime forces seem to have life, but without form. And teleological beings are living forms, or forms of life. That's a term we're going to encounter with Nietzsche. Life forms, forms of life. Teleological beings. And what makes them teleological is that they are giving themselves their own purpose. They have themselves as their own goal. They are the cause of their own effect. They're autonomous in that sense. They're self-determining, self-ruling, autonomous. And free in that respect, meaning they're not the effect of something else, and therefore exhibit the character of freedom. And in fact, these things are not actually separate. Right? These are only analytical distinctions. They're not real distinctions. They're only analytical distinctions. Meaning, we just have one cognitive faculty of our subjectivity, and analytically, you can break it down, and hopefully in a helpful way, between understanding, reason, and judgment. But in fact, we're doing all three all the time. Similarly, in terms of the analytical distinction of phenomena, an object is beautiful because it does seem to have the character of being alive. So already, a beautiful object has the character, it exhibits the character of a teleological being, purposiveness without purpose. Similarly, when we experience a force as sublime, it seems to have a life of its own. So, again, if we understand our experience of both the beautiful and the sublime as having this teleological character, and yet we do distinguish, experientially we distinguish between objects and forces, we do. And that's why it might make sense for us to distinguish between beautiful objects and sublime forces, even though they both partake of the character of teleological beings. And finally, because this is going to be closer to Schiller's heart than it was to Kant's, the work of art. The work of art is more than just a beautiful object. The work of art has the character of a teleological being. And so, with Schiller, we are halfway between Kant and Hegel. And I mentioned that where Kant says, analytically, phenomenally, nature is the better example than the work of art, because nature appears in its spontaneity to have an autonomy that works of art as made objects fail to have, because they seem to be heteronymous in the sense that they were made by someone and they didn't make themselves. Even if the work of art appears to give itself its own life, we know it was made by a person, and therefore it has a different character of autonomy than nature, than natural phenomena, which we don't think were made by anybody. Schiller is sort of bringing things more into the ambit of art, and we'll see that Hegel flips it all the way around next week and says, in fact, when talking about our subjective experience of the aesthetic, when thinking about the aesthetic per se, art is the better example than nature. And it's the better example precisely because it's made by people and not a spontaneous phenomenon of nature, because a spontaneous phenomenon of nature has a natural origin and is therefore not free, whereas man-made things are free by virtue of being human-made. Meaning, works of art were made by freedom, nature was not. Right, so Schiller is halfway between those two positions in terms of the character of the phenomena in question. Character of natural phenomena, the character of artificial phenomena, or art. So Schiller is trying to bring things more into the realm of art. Now, why? Now, we spent a lot of time in the first half of the class, and I feel like we didn't budget time in all this way. We were not efficient about it. The reason is because the political realm is man-made. The political realm is man-made. Which again, prior to these revolutions, the political realm was not seen as man-made. It was seen as made by God or the gods or divine forces outside of us. or by nature. The political realm was the product of external. The political realm was heteronymous. It was not a phenomenon of human autonomy. It was not a phenomenon of human freedom. Now, however, we have a totally different view of the political realm. We see the political realm as man-made, product of freedom, not caused by external circumstances or forces or intentions. Democracy, yeah, democracy, absolutely. And then these kind of bourgeois thinkers, they do hark back to the ancient world, where there were thoughts like this. Plato and Aristotle giving us some thoughts about this, that the political sphere was man-made, was not made by the gods or by nature. But could only be properly made by a certain class of people, because everyone else was too tied down by necessity to be able to actually create the political state. Right, so only free men were totally unencumbered by practical necessity to be able to create a political state. Not what Schiller thinks. Nor is it what Kant thought. Meaning, we create a political state despite or in and through the fact that we are tied down by practical necessity in society. And so it's not like the state is the pure realm of freedom divorced from necessity. No. But it's this dialectic of freedom and necessity. And that art is like that. But art is like politics. I think that I mentioned when we were talking about the dialectic of being and becoming, nature and spirit, geistic. The spiritual, but also the minded, not the mindful, because mindfulness is crap. The minded, right? So there are different domains of minded activity or spiritual activity. Art is one, and politics is another. Where we become conscious of our freedom. We become conscious of our freedom in the realm of politics. We become conscious of our freedom in the realm of art. That's the affinity that Schiller is drawing. Okay, so the state, let's just talk about that since we started with that. He says the aesthetic judgment has to be exercised in the creation of the state. It doesn't mean that the state is a work of art, exactly, in the sense of a beautiful object. However, the state is a teleological being. In other words, this is another Rousseauian idea. Society has a life of its own. And that gets us to alienation. Mark, that you brought up alienation. So alienation is a positive idea of alienation that Rousseau has, that is near and dear to Kant and also Adam Smith. The positive notion of alienation that, and we'll see what Hegel does with this, that we develop ourselves through a process of self-alienation. In other words, we externalize things and then reappropriate those externalizations. So it's a process of alienation and disalienation. It's through that we develop in freedom. So alienation is inseparable from freedom. We're alienated in the way the animals are not because we're free in the way that the animals are not. So alienation is not a pejorative, negative category. It is a positive, productive, constructive category. We externalize ourselves, we create things, and that's how we become free. We elaborate ourselves outside of ourselves, and then we treat those things that we've created as if they have a life of their own, because they do. Right? So that gets us to commodity fetishism, by the way. Society does have a life of its own. So Rousseau's notion is the general will. He recaps some of that Schiller here, that the body politic has a will of its own, and that we kind of know that. that it's more than the sum of its parts. So democracy is a tricky one because democracy is not the aggregate will or the majority will, but the general will, which is not reducible to the majority or the aggregate. So there's, again, a transcendental will, there's a transcendental subject for society.
Well, isn't there also like an artistic element to it because it doesn't exist until it becomes?
Yes, that's right. So it is like clearly the product of becoming. So it's not a product of nature. It's not, it doesn't simply exist. But it also transcends, meaning this is again where the individual person and the body politic have a kind of an affinity, which is that we're not just the product of culture, nor are we just the product of nature. We're the product of both, right? So it's this combination of being and becoming. In the same way that things can only become out of something that already exists. They don't come out of nowhere. The work of art doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of materials. It comes out of cultural traditions. It comes out of history. It comes out of the existing state of affairs, and yet produces something new and different that didn't exist before. Similarly, the person. The person comes into being through an education, not simply by a fact of nature. So, in that way, the person is free, because education can't happen unless the person participates in it. In other words, like education can't just be a matter of like programming an animal. So you can train an animal, you can't educate an animal. You can educate a person because a person can participate in their education in a way that an animal does not participate in their training. It's not behavioral conditioning. Education is not behavioral conditioning. It's not. It requires the active participation of the subject. So the self-determination of the subject is an indispensable element of it. Nonetheless, we do experience it as a process of externalization and reappropriation. So alienation is also inseparable from it. So that's an important point. So again, how do we become aesthetically educated? By experience, and how do we account for that experience? Daisy,
Yeah.
did you have?
Oh, I feel like your notes might be helpful for like hitting
Okay.
categories. Yeah. Is that okay?
Okay, sure. Thank you. Yeah, I basically kind of like put my notes on this. It's kind of long, but because I found like when I'm reading Schiller, he kind of like discusses everything in the like binary concept, but I feel like it's not those so like Kant's like antinomy. It's more like two force interacting with each other. So I found it pretty interesting. So I kind of organized the concept into like one by one. But I kind of skipped most of them. I think jump to the question underlying directly because of time. So my first one is there's another underlying sentence.
Oh wait, hold on. Oh yeah, here we go. Yeah, the underline. Okay. Yep.
Yeah. So first question would be so at the beginning of the article it talks about the natural state and how and the moral man, but and also he addressed it more clearly like in the nature like human beings should go through 3 stages, and not only from natural to moral, but also go through aesthetic man. So I think like comparing to Kant, like who thinks that the different realm of reason coexisting a priori, I think that's kind of like a huge difference, and that also makes me think of Marx's idea of like the human autonomy contains a key to the autonomy of the ape. So like what the future stage already exists in a former form. So I would like to discuss like would you like consider that this is the main difference like between Schiller and Kant, or it's not actually that different?
Well, let's see. So he's certainly grasping it or describing it a little bit differently. So, okay. So, in terms of the sort of ex post facto or kind of retrospective view, right, that the later stage allows you to understand the earlier stage. Yes. Now, okay. So that's similar to Marx, and again, we'll see Hegel has something similar going on. We don't have in Kant that development, right? We have just the different faculties, or we have the different aspects of the one faculty. And so, I mean, all we have is the idea that we change things in practice before we change our understanding. So we have that kind of practical reason seems prior to pure reason. Now, Schiller, on the other hand, like natural state and moral state, it's almost, this is again a little bit of a Rousseauian idea. The state of nature or the natural state is a projection from the moral state. So in other words, it's only from the moral state that we distinguish it from the natural state. You know, and in that way, that duality would only make sense from the standpoint of the moral state. It wouldn't make sense otherwise. Right. And by the way, this is to get back to a question raised by Mark earlier. Why the dualism? The reason for the dualism, and I think that Schiller he uses language that I'm not sure that we have yet in Kant about identity and non-identity. I mean, Schiller uses that language. I'm not sure that Kant did in this critique of judgment. Did we talk about that, identity and entity? I'm not sure if we did. Okay, so the difference between entity and identity. So an entity is a category of being, whereas identity is a category of becoming. In other words, something becomes identical. It doesn't start out identical. So something doesn't simply have identity, it attains identity. It becomes identical in the sense that it attains self-identity. So being, or simply what is, has no self-identity, it just is. It becomes identical to itself. So in this respect, there would be like no self-identity to the natural state. There would only be a self-identity to the moral state, and because the moral state has to explain how it became itself, how it attained identity to itself, it has to posit before itself a natural state that actually never existed. Right? So the state of nature, this is like a kind of Rousseauian idea, is just what came before. In other words, from the current moral state, it looks like what came before was the natural state. And yet you'll never get to the actual originary point. You can only posit it, as Rousseau said, as a thought experiment. Right. So, in other words, it's the movement from the natural to the moral state that matters. It's not the two states.
But in the natural state, he's suggesting that there are already real
Potentialities.
that are setting up the moral state.
Yeah.
So like I get what you're saying, that it's this backwards projection, but it's also like a real period.
Yes, but again, it's only ex post facto a natural state, meaning all human conditions that we know of are the moral state. Meaning hunter-gatherers, nomadic peoples, right? Like pre-civilized peoples, before settled agriculture, that's what we call civilization. Those are moral states. Right? So and we don't have no knowledge of what the natural state of humanity is. Because we have no objectifiable way of understanding it. Meaning that would be before language, before art, before religion. Like being in a natural state when we were just primates, we were unalienated, but we were kind of amoral. We had no way of thinking about our natural state when we were in our natural state. We can only think of our natural state from the perspective of being in the moral state, which we distinguish from the natural state. Right? Because when we were in a state of nature, we had no faculties of knowing, because we had no alienating, externalizing, objectifying things. We just existed. We had no self-identity. In other words, before humans became human. So in archaeology or anthropology, the human revolution. You ever heard this term, the human revolution? When humans became human. When did they become human? When they invented culture. When they invented language, art, religion. Right. So Homo sapiens was not always human. It became human. And who knows when that happened? 100,000 years ago, 200,000 years ago. They keep pushing it back. Right, so we, like again, the I, we didn't exist. Because we couldn't say that we existed, so we didn't exist. That's one way of thinking about it. We couldn't experience ourselves. We couldn't say, this is human nature. The animals never say, what is our nature? We say it because we've transcended it. It's only because we've transcended it that we can ask it. Yeah. Schiller is putting it differently from Kant, but I think it's still essentially a Kantian idea. It's still the reason it's a Kantian idea is that it's this Rousseauian idea. And the Rousseauian idea is that the state of nature is like a hypothetical. It's not like, it's prehistorical, it's not historical. It's a thought experiment. And by the way, in the 1700s, this is the big question. The big question is, what is human nature? You could say in the 1600s as well, right? And then there have been other moments, like in history, where that's been the big question, like what is human nature, where we didn't have an assumed, agreed upon definition of human nature. The one that becomes like the question, what is human nature? And usually those are periods of change. So in periods of change, then we are captivated by this question of what human nature is. So when we're in the process of changing our nature, we ask what our nature is. Otherwise, we just assume it. When we're not changing it, we just assume it. We don't ask it.
When you ask what our nature is there like a time element associated to nature, or is it, like, are we asking of the past, like, what nature
Yes,
was?
or
what
something
nature
outside of
is?
time. Or something outside of time, meaning what would be the invariable,
Yeah.
right? And again, that just becomes bottomless because it turns out that every time has its own idea of what our nature is outside of time. So every historical moment has an idea of what human nature is outside of history. So it's always a function of history. It's always a function of a temporal moment in which it's imposed. So, brought up Descartes, the cogito. Because Kant and Schiller, they are Cartesian in a way, meaning that the answer to the question, what am I? I am what asks the question, what am I? That's what I am. I'm that. I'm the question. right, Socrates, what's knowledge? Knowledge is knowing that you don't know. Right, so it's kind of a history to it. Right, so it kind of begins with Socrates, and then Descartes has his own version.
Is it referring to, is knowing referring to what we are aware of, like our consciousness? Because there is knowing that isn't conscious.
Certainty of knowledge. In other words, like all of our knowledge is provisional, sketchy, questionable, except for the fact that we're asking what it is. Yeah. So again, but that's, knowledge is a funny one because knowledge can be practical and theoretical. Usually knowledge we understand only in theoretical terms, but knowledge to their mind would be practical. Like we would know it in practice, in doing, in acting. Oh, here we go, savage and barbarian, excellent. So, man can be at odds with himself in two ways, either as savage where feeling predominates over principle, or as a barbarian when principle destroys feeling. Now, can we guess which one he might prefer over those two? Yeah, he'd prefer the savage, of course. Like, this is healthy bourgeois common sense. We all prefer the savage over the barbarian. We all prefer feeling to predominate over principle rather than principle predominate over feeling, because we understand principle destroys its own foundation. And that would be barbaric. If you let the rules destroy their own purpose, then they're worse than not having any rules.
And for him, there's like an ethics work in there too, right? Because he's like more forgiving of the innocence of savagery, whereas he sees barbarism as like
Culpable.
cynical and self-consciously bad.
Yep, it's culpable. It can be held accountable. Right? So, exactly. Meaning, the political states of his time can be hauled before the court of justice and overthrown in a revolution, rightfully. You don't expect that of savagery, state of savagery. It's kind of like, oh, do they know that they're doing something wrong? Whereas barbarians, there isn't kind of a knowledge. It's kind of a knowledge, something's wrong, but we're just going to proceed anyway.
Wouldn't the culpability present more like potential for freedom
Sure.
or change than
Sure.
savagery though?
Sure, barbarism is an opportunity and a task of change. So where this comes from, we didn't get into it, so let's pause on this point, which is this language of savagery and barbarism is what the language of the Enlightenment, because it is the language of how they think they can criticize their status quo. Right? So it is about like saying European civilization has become barbaric. And by comparison, the savages that we're encountering in the South Pacific Islands or whatever, like, they don't have our problems. We have a problem, we have to change, right? People in Tahiti don't have to change. They're fine. Europeans definitely have to change. It's not okay. It's barbaric.
But then the ones who don't have to change, they're also missing out on this potential for greater freedom because it doesn't present itself.
No, they live in closer to a state of nature means that they are like unspoiled in their potential. Meaning we have kind of warped, distorted potential, and they just have pure, unadulterated potential. Right. So that's the goal is to bring things back closer to a state of nature.
And he says that savagery can like become free only once it like realizes the dialectic between the two drivers, or once it realizes the play drive, I guess is another way of saying that.
Right. That's right. So, yeah. Let's go there. Okay. So he brings in some other language. I'm glad that you introduced this, which is form and content. And again, like Kant uses some of this language, but Schiller really hones in on it, right? And it's because he's an artist that he has to sort of put it in very, I would say, much clearer terms in terms of the stakes. Right, so there's always a dialectic of form and content. In other words, you can't have content without form, you can't have form without content, you can't have form overrule content without sort of failing. Failing in what way? With the play drive. And that's what we're really talking about. We're talking about the dialectic of the formal and the sensuous drive, which he thinks, again, everyone has. Like, everyone does this. Everyone exercises these faculties of these drives. So, play is what humans do. And when nature appears to play, then we feel sympathy for it because we think of it as human. But who knows whether nature plays or not. Right? So we see like dolphins jumping up out of the ocean and flipping over and doing these stunts, but then scientists analyze and they realize that it actually has a practical purpose, meaning they're not doing it for its own sake. They're doing it because they need to physiologically do these behaviors out of necessity, instinctual necessity. Right? So, but we see them doing these things and we're like, oh, well, they're so playful. Turns out they're not playful. They're instinctual. But we are charmed by it because we think that they're doing what we do. Meaning play is for its own sake. Whereas by contrast, sense drive and form drive are kind of different aspects of necessity expressing itself. So I think that the way that I lined it up for you guys is right. So the question is, what is form? And what is form? What's living form and what's form in the realm of art? What's form as an element of play? So, like giving form or apprehending form, either producing or experiencing form, versus sense. So what is, he's got the two different, I think you guys have this in your notes, the two different kinds of beauty that suggests this. The melting kind of beauty and the energizing kind of beauty. To help illustrate this dialectic of the form drive and the sense drive. So you have those quotations. If man's perfection resides in the harmonious energy of his sensuous and spiritual powers, can in fact only fall short of this perfection, either through lack of harmony or through lack of energy. In order to be adequate to this twofold task, cooperation of both natures, melting beauty will therefore reveal herself under two different guises. If the melting beauty could balance the two drives, what could the energizing beauty do? Oh, this is your question. Okay, so let's get into this in more detail. So what did you make of this distinction?
Yeah, because he mentioned melting and energizing type of beauty for to solve the problem between the unbalanced situation of content, senses drive and formal drive. And he said like it would be problematic if they're both too weak and or like one is too strong, one is stronger than another. So it feels like when they're both strong and balanced, it feels like it feels good. It's good. It's not problematic. So my question would be like, because he didn't describe a lot about the energizing type of beauty, so then what does the energizing type of beauty do different from the melting type?
Well, let's see if we can get help from his actual description, 135.
I was confused about this too.
Hmm?
I was confused about this too.
You were, okay. Okay, hold on. Okay, the melting beauty is later. Hold on. Let's see, reality. Oh yeah, the human being is only fully human when he plays. Okay, here we go. Generic idea of beauty. Is it in the 17th letter? I think that it is.
It's 136.
Oh, it is 136. Yeah, that's okay. Okay, so beauty in the world of reality thus in no way belies the idea we have formed of it by way of speculation, only it has here far less of a free hand than it had there, where we were free to apply it to the pure concept of human nature. In man, as presented by experience, beauty encounters a material already vitiated and recalcitrant, which robs her of her ideal perfection precisely to the extent that it interposes its own individual characteristics. Beauty will therefore, in actuality, never show herself except as a particular and limited species, never as pure genus, so not just as a kind of a category. She will in tense natures lay aside something of her freedom and variety, in relaxed natures something of her vivifying power. But we, who have by now become more familiar with her true nature, should not let ourselves be confused by such discrepancies in her appearance. Far from following the ordinary run of critics, who define the concept of beauty from their individual experience of it, and make of her responsible for the imperfections displayed by man under her influence, we know that it is, on the contrary, man himself who transfers to her the imperfections of his own individuality, who by his own subjective limitation perpetually stands in the way of her perfection and reduces the absolute ideal to two limited types of manifestation. Melting beauty, so it was maintained, is for natures that are tense. Energizing beauty is for those that are relaxed. I call a man tense when he is under the compulsion of thought, no less than when he is under the compulsion of feeling. Exclusive domination of either of his two basic drives is for him a state of constraint and violence, and freedom lies only in the cooperation of both his natures. The man one-sidedly dominated by feeling, or the sensuously tensed man, will be released and set free by means of form. The man one-sidedly dominated by law, or the spiritually tensed man, will be released and set free by means of matter. In order to be adequate to this twofold task, melting beauty will therefore reveal herself under two different guises. First, as a tranquil form, she will assuage the violence of life and pave the way that leads from sensation to thought. Secondly, as living image, she will arm abstract form with sensuous power, lead concept back to intuition, and law back to feeling. The first of these services she renders to natural man, the second to civilized man. But since in neither case does she have completely unconditional control over her human material, but is dependent on that offered her by either the formlessness of nature or the unnaturalness of civilization, she will in both cases still bear traces of her origin and tend to lose herself in the one case more in material life and the other more in pure and abstract form. In order to get some idea of how beauty can become a means of putting an end to that twofold tension, we must endeavor to seek its origins in the human psyche. Resign yourself, therefore, to one more brief sojourn in the sphere of speculation in order, therefore, to leave it for good, and proceed with steps made all the more sure of the terrain of experience. Okay, so you'll see that it's got, what he's got here, there's like, not just two things, but three things, right? So there's not just melting beauty and energizing beauty, but also there's two kinds of melting beauty, right? So melting beauty means that you can kind of bring form to life, or you can sort of, you can bring motion to rest, or you can bring form to life. Right, so I think that when we were talking about this with Kant, with the beautiful, that the beautiful is characterized by an object because it revolves around the object, even though it seems to be more than simply the object in and of itself. So the object appears to be more than itself. Because I think that he actually mentions this, that Kant sort of describes one but not the other. Again, like melting, it's sort of going in both directions. It's sort of congealing or it's sort of unfreezing.
So in that passage, it makes pretty clear the difference between the two powers of melting beauty, but I still didn't see energizing. I missed energizing beauty. I've not seen what that does.
I'm not sure if he talks about it in that level of detail.
Well, he does. I know that we had as a secondary reading the was it Of the Sublime or Concerning the Sublime. There are 2 essays, and I think that that's partially there to help describe this. But wait, I just want to make sure that we're not missing something right here.
Because in that articulation, it seems like melting beauty can kind of handle both cases. So what would even be the need of energizing beauty? Like melting beauty can resolve both a kind of like excess of sense and an excess of
Hold on.
Well,
logic.
isn't it
Melting
in
beauty.
relation to like the subject is closer to nature or not? Or closer to like, senses and not?
Well, right, but it's saying that
That could be
melting
it
beauty
too.
can address both of those. Like melting beauty, that's the passage we just read. Like melting beauty can address.
Melting beauty addresses the transition, doesn't it?
What do you mean by that?
Like it connects both, which in itself is.
Right, but I think that the idea is that like in like a practical experience of it, it can be lopsided, right? We can be like leaning too much into sense or leaning too much into thought. And so
Kant
like,
talks about
these forms of beauty are correct.
133.
Right,
Okay.
and so melting beauty can correct in both directions.
Yeah, neither
It
do I.
can
the
from
bottom.
sense or from thought to like to beauty. But
Okay, let's look at the definition of
If it was
energizing.
closer to nature, it wouldn't be possessed by either.
Right, so he does focus on not the natural state but the civilized state. That's one of the reasons why he does that. Let's look at, it's in the 16th letter. I thought that we might have skipped past it. So he says, this is the tensing effect, right, and the releasing effect. We've seen how beauty results from the reciprocal action of 2 opposed drives and from the uniting of 2 opposed principles. The highest ideal of beauty is therefore to be sought in the most perfect possible union and equilibrium of reality and form. This equilibrium, however, remains no more than an idea, which can never be fully realized in actuality. For in actuality, we shall always be left with the preponderance of the one element of the other, and the utmost that experience can achieve will consist in an oscillation between the 2 principles, in which now reality, now form will predominate. Beauty as an idea, therefore, can never be other than one and indivisible, since there can never be more than one point of equilibrium, whereas beauty in experience will be eternally twofold, because oscillation can disturb the equilibrium in twofold fashion, inclining it now to one side, now to the other. And then he talks about the kind of the actual feeling. I observed in one of the preceding letters, and it follows with strict necessity from the foregoing argument, that we must expect from beauty at once a releasing and a tensing effect. A releasing effect in order to keep both the sense drive and the form drive within proper bounds, and a tensing effect in order to keep both at full strength. Ideally speaking, however, these 2 effects must be reducible to a single effect. Beauty is to release by tensing both natures uniformly, and to tense by releasing both natures uniformly. Thus, this already follows from the concept of reciprocal action, by virtue of which both factors necessarily condition each other. Okay, so let's jump ahead. Energizing beauty can no more preserve man from a certain residue of savagery and hardness than melting beauty can protect him from a certain degree of effeminacy and animation. Okay, so energizing beauty is about that kind of drive to. It's funny because it's form drive and sense drive, and but energizing beauty is about that sort of will to form, right? So whereas the melting beauty is about not just being like determined by the form, right? So that's why melting beauty is about the form sort of not simply being the form, whereas energizing beauty is about how you go from formlessness to form. He thinks that's a necessary element. And I think, vivifying beauty, energizing beauty.
Doesn't one imply more like a relationship between the person experiencing the beauty and the beauty itself, and one is slightly more passive?
Well, it's all about our experience, it is. But then he also wants to use these criteria to talk about how particular works of art function. So he does want to look at certain forms and say, this is how they seem to function. This is how people seem to experience them. Hold on. Energizing beauty can no more preserve man from a certain residue of savagery and hardness than melting beauty can protect him from a certain degree of effeminacy and enervation. So that's a complicated statement because it's sort of opposites, meaning melting beauty takes the civilized and sort of allows them more the experience of the savage, whereas the energizing beauty is what lifts us out of savagery into form and civilization. For since the effect of the former is to brace his nature, so again, energizing beauty is about this kind of will to form, both physical and moral, and to increase its elasticity and power of prompt reaction. It can happen all too easily that the increased resistance of temperament and character will bring about a decrease in receptivity and impressions, that our gentler humanity too will suffer the kind of repression that ought to be directed to our brute nature, and our brute nature profit from an increase of strength that should only be available to the free person. Again, the energizing beauty is about the will to form, whereas the melting beauty is about this kind of relaxation of form. So that we're not, I don't know if that makes sense. Energizing.
Can you scroll it down just a few lines so
Yeah.
the top?
On the next page?
Just where it is now, just a few
Uh-huh.
lines, just top of that page.
The top of this page?
Yes.
Oh, okay. This tensing effect.
Yeah, I just want to see that. Keep both of those.
So another way of thinking about it is we use art to stimulate us, but also to relax us. So he's trying to talk about the different aspects of it, and that if it goes too far in one direction, then it seems to lose its kind of aesthetic power.
Or like parts in a could it be comparable to parts in like a symphony, where like the intensifying parts are like the will to it's like taking shape, and then
Right.
there's some parts that are more like
Right.
I think I get the mechanistic distinction now. So like,
Mhm.
there's two ways that the harmony can fall out of balance.
Mm-hmm.
One way is if one of the two drives becomes excessive,
Mm-hmm.
and the other way is if one of the two drives becomes
Too weak.
insufficient.
Right.
So basically, melting or releasing, the releasing effect, melting drive, the melting beauty is the one that makes sure that neither is in overdrive, and the tensing effect is to make sure that none of them are underperforming essentially. Okay, that makes sense.
The reason that we're going to revisit this with Nietzsche, where there are so many parallels between Schiller and Nietzsche on this point, is that Nietzsche is going to make the argument that our own understanding, like our kind of cognizance, our explanation of aesthetics has been too Apollonian and has neglected the Dionysian, that you can't really have one without the other. In other words, the experience of art is about form giving, but also form dissolving. And that it's a place where we kind of experience ourselves as ourselves, and it's also a place where we lose ourselves. Right? So the experience of art has this dual character of, kind of defining our subjectivity, but also of loosening the bounds of our subjectivity.
And without the energizing beauty, the art wouldn't have a shape within itself.
That's right.
Because it would be dependent on external form.
That's right. So it wouldn't sort of prompt, it wouldn't seem to be something that's affecting us.
Yeah.
Right. That's right.
Isn't this melting, energizing distinction necessary because it allows them to say that art can cure savagery and
Barbarism, that's right.
in different directions?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So in this respect, aesthetic education is what lifts us out of savagery, but also prevents us from descending into barbarism, in his view. And, basically, he thinks it has to do with the way we experience the world, but also the way we experience ourselves. And I think that's why he gets into that fine-grained discussion of, the kind of benefit of art, if you will, but also the necessity of art. And so why we would need art? What do we do with art? What do we actually do with the experience of art? And I'll just say this before, because we've gone over already. He's giving voice to something that's been developing for hundreds of years, meaning there is a long body of work since the Renaissance and even going back to classical antiquity of talking about why we have art, like what do humans do with art. So what he's adding to it, right, is this sense of freedom, which again he thinks the savage doesn't have and the barbarian also doesn't have. Right? That, in other words, that the savage has no occasion to experience their own freedom and the barbarian has lost touch with their freedom. Right? And so that's where art has this necessary function of the way we experience ourselves as free. That without it, we can't experience ourselves as free. Because we can't experience that play between the form drive and the sense drive. Right, so we would just be in sort of spontaneous nature or in sort of mechanized kind of principle. So it's a curious thing because it's very, it has this kind of advocacy character of it, but it's also an attempt to explain why all societies, all communities, all forms of humanity have had art. Like everyone has always had art, right? And so there does seem to be some necessary character to art. And we'll see what Hegel says next week about this, meaning it is based on this Kant and Schiller idea, which is that the reason that all humans ever have had art is that all humans ever have been free, even if they've experienced their freedom differently and objectified it differently and developed it differently, but that art demonstrates this. And therefore seems to be in that way necessary. That all communities, all cultures have had this autonomous character, whether they've recognized it or not, and that art is a way that it manifests. But we'll get there. I think that Hegel will bring some of these things around. While Schiller has really given us, and yeah, I am sorry if it's unclear at times, but tried to give us a more kind of detailed description of the feelings than we had with Kant, and also than we will have with Hegel, although he'll characterize it in certain ways. Okay, see you guys next week.